Hello, everyone. It's been a good week, hasn't it? Today, I'd like to talk about complementary forces. It's a well known phenomenon throughout many religions, throughout many ways of thought, whether it be in philosophy or metaphysics, on complementary forces. One of the most go to examples of this is the yin and the yang. It's known as the dynamic between good and evil, light and dark. In the Bible, it is very prevalent. In metaphysics and in philosophy, it is also prevalent. So I propose the idea that all these things are the same idea, but different examples of either expressing or observing these phenomena. It's important to see how, in terms of light and dark, for example, it is known as good and evil sometimes, that you cannot have one without the other. And this is stuff that people easily can grasp. They can easily see, like, how do you know that evil exists or that good exists if you don't have one in contrast to the other? These same phenomenon also exist in terms of energy, power, or words or lack thereof. Um, it is different, however, from, let's say, in a scientific perspective, how like heat or how cold is different. For example, cold might be known as the absence of heat, or as darkness might be known as the absence of light. In the Bible, it is said that if anything were to be added, or if anything were to be removed, that the man who should do that would die, and that they would suffer the plagues either mentioned in the book or be separated from the benefits also within the book. When taking that reference and talking about the tree of life and death in itself, when consuming from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it is generally understood that when you partake in the tree of life, that you have eternal life. But it doesn't give you any indication as to what you are partaking from besides life in itself. Life itself being something that we understand as us right now living. Is it possible that life within the context of the Bible means something completely different than life as we know it right now? It is not necessary that it is the breath of life that we're taking right now, or just being alive in how we know it right now, and this, for what I would say, is this uh, dimension. As we know, we live in a three-dimensional world. Is it possible that life in this case means that it's a life that is not necessarily an eternal life, but something that exists within another dimension, or something that exists within a realm that we are not aware of? Meaning that I'm trying to point out what life could mean in this particular case. Is it possible that life in this particular case, when knowledge of good and evil comes from what we know right now, that when you gain this life, you lose that knowledge, or that you're separated from it? Like you might just be something that is in existence. For example, can we say that phenomenon such as gravity is alive? Can we say phenomenon such as uh, physical things such as rotation or vibrations that have their upward and downward motions are alive? Do they have some type of consciousness of themselves? Now, I don't know if I would have to define consciousness in this particular case, but just for the sake of this talk here, if consciousness is related to or put alongside knowledge, or what you or your ability to know things, most people would say that they're conscious because they know that they exist, or that they can think, and that is their example of consciousness. So why are complementary forces separated from one another? I think it's important because it creates a dynamic, or a kind of law. You can imagine that there's laws of the universe that we are not aware of. We can observe them. We know that they might do things in the greater universe, but as to say that we know what those laws are, not necessarily. Complementary forces, in terms of how they would behave or why they're necessary to be separated, I think it has to do with how it's a chaos and order type of situation, where you have a universe that's in constant chaos, as many people before me have pointed out, and we as human beings try to create order within this chaos, or we have this consciousness which is trying to create a unified order that we all want or that we all believe, and it's like a constant cycle of our consciousness trying to force or create order within this chaos that exists around us. So, in the same way that we exist and we can perceive the chaos that's around us, in the same way that the chaos is necessary for us to be able to perceive it in the first place, it's in the same way that when you talk about light and dark in terms of good and evil, good and evil has moral and ethical implications. You think that things like murder, things like theft, things like, you know, just poor behavior, you see it as being either morally wrong or ethically wrong. And as human beings, we come together and we say, we believe this, we want things to happen this way. But light and dark, in terms of good and evil, which is greater than ourselves, it's almost like this kind of thing where you believe that there's no real good and evil. Going back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that's probably an interpretation of how we perceive it in, as opposed to how it actually is within the universe. There could be, as I'm saying before, no such thing as evil. We just see that we don't like this and we call it evil. What if good and evil, in the terms of the universe, are complementary forces in of themselves, as to say that we as human beings observe things that we say is evil, like lava, or like a star exploding, or like some type of thing being damaged, and shrapnel goes everywhere, or like you have meteorites go everywhere around the universe that can go at enough speeds that it destroys everything in its path, and we'll say, wow, that all of that is destruction, and we can perceive that as being bad. But in the grand scheme of things, all these different types of destruction causes life somewhere else. It causes energy to happen somewhere else. It's almost to say that good and evil are necessary or are complementary to each other in order for them to both exist. So when we're talking about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you talk about the tree of life, and you go further than that and talk about death, death is a result of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil as per the Bible. But what does that say about the tree of life? Why is it not the tree of life and death? Is there no such thing as actual death in terms of like the universe, or even like ourselves as human beings, our consciousness? If our consciousness is somewhat alive in of itself, or our collective consciousness is alive in of itself, is it that when someone dies, they join some other variation of that consciousness, or another vibration or phenomenon thereof? Not to say that I can perceive that, the interpretation of the tree of life is not the tree of life and death. I mean, if eating from the tree of life is, as a result, is eternal life, is there such a thing as eternal death? Because I have a problem trying to understand how you have these complementary forces of opposing sides known throughout all types of different religions. It's known throughout the Bible. It's known throughout different types of ideas such as um, heat or lack of heat. So, is it that our interpretation of the tree of life is incomplete in terms of eternal life, or is a source of eternal life? I bring all this stuff up and all these questions up because I think we a little bit lost it when we think about the Bible simply as parables, or we think about ancient texts, or we think about religions as simply forms of governance or morals, or I guess you could say being able to see where our morals come from. I think that people of the past were very intelligent and they were able to observe things that we're observing today. I think they understood phenomenon that we are having issues understanding today. Although I believe in science to some degree, I think our reliance on science has gotten a little bit out of hand where you are having trouble these days to kind of put philosophy into this idea of science and combine it along with, not necessarily religions, but type of beliefs that you could say are metaphysical beliefs, or people that have ideas that come from within themselves. So from these questions is kind of like coming from the point of view of an observation of the universe and an observation of things that we see around us that have greater structures or greater, I guess you could say, phenomenon in terms of forces, in terms of complementary forces in particular, for this video. If you were as a, ancient man, so to speak, and you notice that when you throw things, they curve a certain way or they drop a certain way, you wouldn't necessarily have a way to explain that as gravity, for example, or you wouldn't have a way to say that it's a force of inertia. You could see that as different gods. You could see that as different angels. Imagine for a second that you are perceiving that when you throw something, an angel is taking it from your hand and carrying it across to the destination which you want it to land. That would be an exercise of imagining how, as a thought experiment, that other forces in the universe, such as the stars, the skies, shooting stars, rockets in terms of comets, rockets in terms of stars that are leaving behind traces from their previous explosions or creations, that we see those things as concepts of good, concepts of evil, uh, concepts of, I guess you could say, um, different types of beasts that exist within a realm that's higher dimension than ourselves. And from this perspective is how I bring these questions in order to perhaps, through conversing with each other or trying to reach higher stages of consciousness in terms of sharing information with each other in this idea of consciousness, that we can come to some new conclusions for the next generation.